Bona tarda a tothom. Good afternoon. Malgrat la pandèmia, teníem moltes ganes de fer aquest acte, la lliçó inaugural. Aquest any amb la Claire Wardle, cofundadora i directora de First Draft. Thank you very much, Claire Wardle, for accepting the proposal. I am sure your conference will be very inspiring to our students. Per què fem aquesta lliçó inaugural? Doncs perquè, com bé sabeu, els que ens esteu escoltant, i especialment els alumnes de primer, sabeu que la desinformació és una xacra, els periodistes han d'assumir responsabilitats i First Draft ho fa. Cal plantar cara a les fake news. Avui la complexitat del món ens obliga al periodisme a estar més amatents que mai. La majoria de les persones que esteu escoltant voleu ser periodistes i, per tant, és molt important que tingueu present que la informació falsa afebleix les democràcies, crea desconcert als ciutadans i, sobretot, obliga a actuar a la classe política i ho ha de fer ja. Walter Lippmann, fa molts anys, fa 100 anys, va escriure que l'estat modern ha de tenir el màxim interès en mantenir nets els torrents de fets, dels fets, vaja, que alimenten els rius de l'opinió. Per tant, la desinformació no és cosa de fa 4 dies, no és cosa d'ahir. Sempre hi ha hagut desinformació, hi ha hagut, en part, fake news. El problema d'avui, segurament, és que hi ha una ràpida propagació de la mentida i de la desinformació. Bé, no em vull estendre més, només dir-vos que la sessió d'avui ha estat possible gràcies a la col·laboració de molta gent, del Consolat General dels Estats Units a Barcelona, i l'organització de l'acte l'hem d'agrair a moltes persones d'aquest mateix consolat i de la facultat. A l'Helena Pujol, a l'Emma Marwood, a la Cristina Perales, al Xavier Ramon i a tota la gent de secretaria de la Facultat de Comunicació. Precisament ara passo la paraula a la senyora Emma Marwood, Public Affairs Officer, cònsol de diplomàcia pública del Consolat General dels Estats Units a Barcelona. Emma Marwood joined the U.S. Consulate General in Barcelona as a Public Diplomacy Officer in Barcelona in August 2020. She came from Mexico City, where she served at the INLO-TREC officer, coordinating public affairs issues across Mission Mexico for Meridia Initiative. She has a bachelor degree for Georgetown University School of Foreign Services. I now give the floor to Emma Marwood. Thank you very much, Emma.
Muchas gracias, Carlos. Buenas tardes a todos. On behalf of the U.S. Embassy and Consulate, I want to thank Universitat Pompeu Fabra for hosting this event, and also thank, of course, our guest speaker, Claire Wardle, who kindly accepted our invitation to deliver the inaugural address at the Journalism School. Claire Wardle, the director of First Draft, is going to discuss one of the priority issues that our embassy and consulate are addressing from a public diplomacy perspective, which is the threat of disinformation, its impact on democratic societies, and how we can prevent and counter its effects by promoting media literacy. For over a year, the U.S. Embassy and Consulate in Spain have been organizing events like workshops and seminars on media literacy for youth, and we continue to do so throughout Spain. We've supported the creation of the recently launched web platform Learn to Check, which is designed for the education community. It's a platform that provides basic tools and resources to help recognize online misinformation and disinformation. We've coordinated in-person and virtual events with partner institutions involving US-based experts, just such as our guest today, to share insights on the challenges of disinformation, help us understand its ecosystem, and give us clues on how to confront this dangerous infodemic. Claire, it's an honor to have you with us today. We really look forward to your remarks and your discussion with the participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Passo la paraula al Xavier Ramon, el cap d'estudis dels estudis de periodisme de la Universitat Pompeu Fabra, qui presentarà a la professora Claire Wardle.
Vale, com que era algo que podria passar en el darrer moment, si us sembla, Carles, amb el teu permís, doncs passo a fer la presentació de la Claire. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Claire Wardle for the inaugural lecture of the degree in Journalism Studies at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. Thank you very much for being here and for sharing your knowledge and insights with our students and faculty. Dr. Wardle is a leading expert on user-generated content, verification and misinformation. She is co-founder and director of First Draft, the world's foremost non-profit organization focused on research and practice to address misinformation and disinformation. Previously, Dr. Wardle was a research fellow at the Schornstein Center for Media, Politics and Public Policy. She was also the research director at the Tow Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia Journalism School. She has worked with newsroom and humanitarian organizations around the world, providing training and consultancy on digital transformation. Dr. Wardle earned a PhD in communications and a master's in political science from the University of Pennsylvania. In 2017, she co-authored a report for the Council of Europe entitled Information Disorder Toward an Interdisciplinary Framework for Research and Policymaking. Among her most recent work, we should highlight the research under the surface, COVID-19 vaccine narrative, misinformation and data deficits on social media. In this research that has published this month, Claire Wardle, Rory Smith and Seb Cowan have analyzed the dominant vaccine narrative on social media platforms in English, French and Spanish online communities. Many of those narratives are dangerous since can contribute to erode public trust in COVID-19 vaccine and vaccines more generally. This work alerts us that when people can't easily access reliable information around vaccines and when mistrust in actors and institutions related to vaccines is high, misinformation narratives rush into file to vacuum. In clear connection with this topic today, Claire Wardle will deliver the lecture Conspiracies, Rumors and Falsehoods, the truth about why the infodemic is so dangerous. After the lecture, Dr. Wardle will be able to answer your questions and comments. Many thanks for being here, Claire. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to join you. I am very sad that I am not currently in Barcelona, which is one of my favorite cities. You might be able to tell from my accent that I am not American, I am British, but I currently live in New York. But because I'm British, of course, I have traveled to Spain many times and Barcelona many times. So it's a real pleasure to talk to you today from New York, but knowing that you're all in one of my favorite cities. So I'm also very excited because you are going to be journalists, hopefully, or you have at least decided that you want to study journalism. Some people might say that this is a difficult time to become a journalist. We have politicians around the world attacking journalists, calling journalists enemies of the state. But I'm telling you now, there is almost not a more important job right now. The infodemic that we are struggling with, the information disorder that we are struggling with, requires us to take quality information seriously. But it also requires us to take storytelling seriously. There are ways to tell stories that impact society, and we need that more than ever. So congratulations on choosing a wonderful degree. And again, I'm sorry that I'm not there to celebrate with you, but in the absence of a glass of champagne to celebrate the beginning of your degree, I'm going to give you a lecture. You will have many lectures over the next few years, but hopefully this is one that is interesting to you. So I have a few slides, so I'm going to share my screen and go through this with you. And hopefully I have images, I have graphics, and it should make it easier to follow along. So the first thing is, if somebody's going to talk at you for 40 minutes, you should know why it might be worth listening to them. So just a little bit about my background is that I used to be a lecturer at Cardiff University in Wales. And in 2008, I wrote a study for the BBC about user-generated content. It was 2008, so the BBC was saying, what's Facebook? What's Twitter? The audience is sending us images via text message and over email, and we don't know whether or not they're true, and we don't know how to do this work, and can you help us? So I wrote a report, and I thought that would be the end of it. But very soon afterwards, this happened, which was January 2009. You may have seen the film with Tom Hanks, and a plane landed in the Hudson River just next to Manhattan. And the passengers survived by standing on the wings, and a man who was on a ferry took this photo and tweeted it. Now, it's hard to imagine, but in January 2009, very few people were using Twitter. And so when this happened, the head of BBC News Gathering called me and said, none of my journalists know what Twitter is. None of my journalists found this picture. And even if they had, they didn't know how to verify it. And they didn't know whether they could use this picture legally or ethically. Can you leave your job as an academic and can you come and help the BBC for 6 months? So I said, okay. I called my mum, who said, you're crazy. And I said, oh, it's all right, Mum. I can go back to academia, but this is a real opportunity. And so that was 11 years ago. And I'm still working with industry, teaching newsrooms, nonprofits, governments, health authorities, how to work out what is true online. Because my very small research topic has now become a topic that the rest of the world cares about. And on one hand, I'm sad about that. But on the other hand, it has given me this incredible opportunity to continue researching this topic that I've always been so passionate about. So I now lead the US team. We have an office in London, New York, and Sydney, and we help organizations around the world think about this challenge of disinformation. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those labels, but we help organizations think about the challenges of mis and disinformation. And as mentioned in the introduction, I wrote this report in 2017 with my co-author Hossein Darakhshan, and we coined this term information disorder. And in many ways, this report, even though it's almost 3 years old now, still has many elements that I think are worth repeating. The first one being this, is that as humans, we have an emotional relationship to information. That doesn't matter how educated you are, it doesn't matter your gender, your race, we are all human and we have an emotional relationship to information. It is not rational. So when people say, we just need more facts, yes, we do, but that's not the only answer because we engage with information that we have an emotional relationship to. We also have to understand that the information that we share is tied into our identity. When we share something on Instagram, we are trying to perform our identity. What is it that we believe? What is it that we like? Who is it that we're connected with? We are all performing online. And so there is a ritual element to this. Partly, as we know, social media is addictive, but we also have rituals about the kind of information we share, the kind of information we consume. There is a ritual element to this, and we have to recognize that. In the same way as purchasing and reading newspapers has always been a ritual, we now have to understand how that has moved into the online space. I also made the point in this report that visuals are very, very important. That too often people think about text. Academics, fact checkers, researchers, journalists, they love text. But actually, what's most important is we live in a visual culture now. And so bad actors, those people who are trying to sow disinformation and chaos, they understand visuals. And those of us who work in the quality information space, we also need to get better at visuals. I would spend so much money on giving designers to the WHO, health authorities, newsrooms. We need more designers in this space. And finally, this argument about the pivot to privacy, which is, this is something that Mark Zuckerberg talked about 2 years ago. And that's because he was watching the data and he understood that people are now more likely to spend time in WhatsApp groups, Facebook Messenger groups, Facebook groups, email, SMS. Over the last 10 years, we have learned that what we put online can sometimes cause us damage. It leads to harassment. We can talk more about particularly women who are working in this space, the kind of harassment they get. But what that means is there has been a chilling effect on speech. And so more speech has now moved into these closed spaces. Now that's a real challenge when we're thinking about mis and disinformation, because it's impossible to monitor what's happening on WhatsApp. It's an encrypted space. And so what does that mean for journalists and fact checkers and health authorities when more and more rumors are traveling in spaces that we can't see? So there's a number of issues that I wrote about in 2017 that are still very pertinent to the discussions that we're going to have today. So in terms of today's talk, I'm going to start with an overview of key information disorder concepts. I'm then going to talk about 4 psychological theories to help you as journalists when you think about your reporting, but also when you're talking with friends and family. I'm then going to end with key takeaways on this issue of information disorder. I'm going to share a couple of resources, and then there's going to be plenty of time for questions. So in terms of key information disorder concepts, this was a diagram that we created in that report. And we wanted people to understand the difference between disinformation, which is false information that is created and shared by people who know it's false or misleading and are deliberately trying to cause harm. That is actually a relatively small number of people who are creating disinformation. The biggest problem we have is misinformation. When people find that content, they don't realize it's false or misleading, and they reshare it, not meaning any harm because they don't know it's false or misleading. And that is different to a third category, which we called malinformation, which is genuine content that is shared deliberately to cause harm. So there is a reason that we should have encrypted networks. There's a reason that we email each other and we don't think that it's going to be shared publicly. So when people share that private correspondence, that is done to cause harm. So that might be revenge porn, or it might be people screenshotting private conversations on Twitter DMs. That is genuine, but it is shared to cause harm. So we wanted people to understand this whole landscape. And I still think it's important to think about those differences if we're thinking about interventions. An intervention to prevent Russians meddling in a US election, that's disinformation. And those interventions are going to be different to misinformation, which is my mum resharing a meme that she doesn't realize is false and she doesn't mean any harm. And so just to kind of strip back some of these key issues, there are 4 motivations for why people create and share this kind of content. The first one is financial. There are still many, many people making money by getting people to click on bad quality, what look like news sites. They might be creating scams about COVID-19 or hoaxes. There are still, unfortunately, too many people making money off bad quality content. The other motivation might be political, and it might be internationally, people trying to impact elections. It might be domestically impacting somebody's reputation. But that might be, we see obviously a lot of political disinformation, and that has been the focus, particularly in the US. But when it comes to why people share this content too, we have to think about social and psychological factors. There are a lot of people who are part of, for example, conspiracy communities. And the reason they're part of that community is because it's a community. People listen to them. They take their fears seriously. They are connected with other people online. This social cohesion part of misinformation is really critical. When people are sharing misinformation about vaccines in mums groups, it's because they feel a camaraderie with other mothers and they're nervous about vaccines and they want answers. And that community, when they post these things, they get reinforcement. And that's a really critical part of this conversation, and we can't ignore it. And the last one is psychological, which I don't really understand. But there are people out there who just share this content knowing it's false to see if they can get away with it. They just want to cause trouble. They target journalists to see if they can get away with it. And it's hard to explain, but unfortunately, that is a category that we need to take seriously. And so again, back in 2017, I'm somewhat famous, not very famous, but infamous, I think is the word, for refusing to use the term F***** news. And that's partly because the term itself doesn't describe the problem. Most of the content we see is not fake. It's genuine, but it's used out of context. And most of the content we see isn't news. It doesn't even look like news. It's videos, it's memes, it's GIFs, it's images. And so it's just not a very helpful term. And more importantly, and you should take this seriously as people who hopefully want to be journalists, The term has been weaponized by politicians who want to undermine a free and independent press. It's in their interest to undermine those who would hold them accountable. And so when journalists use the phrase fake news, I say, why are you using that phrase? It's a weapon. It's being used to harass you. And so by using it, you are co-opting language that's being used against you. And so what's happened over the last 3 years is that unfortunately it has worked. And if I walk down the street and say to people, so what's fake news? They're probably going to say, and we have research that shows this, they say the BBC, New York Times, El País. They see the professional media as being those that they define as fake news. So I think we should use language that describes what we're talking about. Conspiracies, lies, rumors, propaganda. We should be more exact in the terminology that we use. So I came up with these 7 types of mis and disinformation, and they're on a spectrum. On one hand, I talked about satire or parody, and some people said, Claire, you can't use satire. That's a form of art. And it's true, but bad actors label things as satire deliberately, knowing that fact checkers won't touch it and hoping that it fools people into sharing it. And over time, the more it gets shared, the more people lose an understanding that it's satire. So we actually see it as a tactic used by bad actors. But I also talked about false connection. So things like clickbait headlines, that to me is a form of information disorder. Having a headline that promises one thing and when you get there, it's not delivered. That to me is a form of information disorder. Things like misleading content, poor uses of quotations or statistics or diagrams. We've always had misleading content in the news. That unfortunately is also part of information disorder. The next type is false context. As I said, genuine content shared with false contextual information. It might be an image that says it's from today, but it's actually from 2016. It might be an image saying it's a protest in Barcelona, but actually it's an image from Rome. Those kind of examples are what we see the most of because they're free to use, very quick to make, and are actually very, very persuasive to people because they are genuine. It's the context that has been weaponized. Imposter content, when people use trusted logos or the names of people that you know, that is a deliberate tactic because our brains are constantly looking for mental shortcuts to help us understand the world. These are called heuristics. And then when you have a mental shortcut that says, oh, look, that's the New York Times logo, you are more likely to trust it because you trust the New York Times. And then I talk about manipulated content when imagery is spliced together. And at the end, we have fabricated content. This is the bucket of content that we see the least. It's rare that you see an absolute fabricated lie or rumor. Yes, you do see that, but things like deep fakes, this fear that we have about artificial intelligence creating completely false videos, we're not there yet. And if you're a bad actor, why spend the money and go to the trouble of creating completely new content when you can just create false context? So let's just take these examples in the context of COVID. The Onion, you may have heard of The Onion. It's an American satirical site. I don't know a Spanish satirical site. I don't know a Pakistani satirical site. I think on Wikipedia, there's 67 different satirical sites around the world. And the problem is on Facebook, everything looks the same. So you have these challenges with people not knowing whether it's satire or not. Things like headlines. This is actually a fact checker in India. They do great work. But this challenge of, do you repeat the rumor in the headline? Does drinking alcohol prevent coronavirus? That makes me want to click on it. But you get there, and is that necessarily, I mean, in this example, it's a debunk, but we have to think about this problem with headlines when people only read the headlines and they don't read the content of the article. Diagrams and graphs, unfortunately, are very prone to misleading content. This is a graph from earlier in March, talking about number of positive tests for COVID-19. So it looks terrible. Look at the positive tests in New York are off the scale. Well, unless you are cross-referencing that with the number of tests being completed in the first hand, then that graph is for nothing. And so these sorts of things, when people have low levels of statistical training, mean that unfortunately journalists are making mistakes in some of their reporting that's causing more harm. So even the reporting around the new vaccines, the Pfizer versus today's announcement about AstraZeneca in the UK, well, they look like they've got different percentages of effectiveness, but that's because the AstraZeneca tests were a different methodology. And if reporters just report on press releases and don't ask those questions about methodology, it ends up looking misleading, and it ends up having conspiracy theorists saying, what's going on? And they're saying that because of what looks like confusion in the reporting around something. False context, as I said, this is when you have genuine imagery used out of context. So this graph was shared very widely earlier this year, and it was being discussed, this is in Australia, saying that it's a new map showing predicted movements of Wuhan residents, and this was going to spread the coronavirus. Well, surprise, surprise, this is actually a genuine map from 2011. There's nothing false about this map. The falsity is the context by which it's being shared. And so the challenge for computational content moderation systems is, if I'm a computer, I have to read this and say, okay, I have to make sense of what the text says. I have to recognize that the map is 7 or 9 years out of date, and I have to connect the two and say the combination of these two things is misleading. Like, we're getting there with computers, but this is actually why this kind of content is really, really effective, and lots of social platforms don't necessarily have the ways to do this yet unless they've got fact checkers who can help. Imposter content, this was being circulated in Los Angeles back in March. This was actually a flyer that was being put through people's mailboxes. Not all of this content ends up online. We also have to remember what it looks like offline. And so here you had the CDC logo and the WHO logo. And why would you not believe this? This looks very, very official. So it's a very effective way of making people think something that's not true. Manipulated content. On the right-hand side, this is the genuine image, which was a meeting of the foreign affairs minister from Sudan and a diplomat from China. And so that was the original image. It takes no time for somebody to Photoshop a mask on to the official from Sudan, and then all of a sudden you've got a xenophobic, hate-filled message that has taken somebody 2 seconds to make. So this kind of content, again, we see circulating very widely because it taps into people's existing prejudices, existing worldviews. And when this was in February, at the time, there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment because of the virus, and this fit into that sentiment that was being shared. And finally, with coronavirus, there are these big rumors. This was actually being pushed by a wellness nutritionist in Australia, pushing this idea that SARS plus HIV equaled coronavirus. This idea that coronavirus was man-made, these kind of fabricated rumors being circulated online, and unfortunately they still continue. And so what I want you to think through when you are considering information disorder is that it's not just a case of, if you look on Facebook, you'll find it. If you look on Twitter, you'll find it. You need to understand the whole ecosystem. And this is what we do at First Draft. And what we've learned over the years of doing this is that when you have coordinated campaigns, they start on the anonymous web. So that might be 4chan, it might be 8kun, it might be Discord, it might be places that people congregate to make plans. They might say at 6 p.m, use this hashtag, everybody. At 7 p.m, use this Dropbox folder full of different memes. So they're doing that kind of coordination. That then might move into places like WhatsApp groups, Twitter DM groups, where you've got people who are coordinating this kind of amplification. Because as the platforms have cracked down on bots and automation, you saw humans who are now acting, doing the same thing. So we call them cyborgs because they're humans, but they look like bots. So you have that kind of coordination happening in a network of closed networks. Then it might spread onto conspiracy communities. So For example, we're seeing many people move on to Parler now, places like Gab, even BitChute or YouTube, or Reddit even. They're more open, but on those platforms, you have these more conspiratorial communities. From there, it often will jump onto more mainstream social media, so Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. And unfortunately, this is the place that journalists pick it up. Because if we go back to the start of this megaphone, those, and they're mainly men, but these guys, they don't have a very big audience. The only way they can be successful is if they find an audience. And so they find an audience by pushing their rumors through the information ecosystem. Because the hope is that the professional media will either report something that's false, not realizing it as false. And if the journalist does their job and verifies it, the second best outcome is that a journalist debunks it. Because if a journalist debunks a rumor irresponsibly, it can give that rumor oxygen that it wouldn't otherwise have. And that's really what people are hoping to do. And that's why being a journalist today is particularly challenging, but also exciting. Because for journalists, there's always been this idea that more sunlight is a disinfectant. The more you report on something, the more that you uncover problems, or you uncover the way that power has been misused. But when it comes to disinformation, the bad actors want you to report on them. They want you to give them legitimacy and oxygen. And that's the challenge. And the other thing I would say now is that it's not just the professional media. They are also hoping to get celebrities to talk about their rumors. And they also want politicians to talk about their conspiracies. Because once celebrities or politicians talk about a rumor, it's very, very, very difficult for a professional news outlet to say, we're not going to cover it. So that's the information ecosystem that I want you to remember, that there is a deliberate tactic to get amplification, and newsrooms are being targeted and manipulated to do so. And that's what makes this really, really challenging. And I would add also female journalists, and there are a number of excellent female disinformation reporters. In the UK, there's Mariana Spring, who writes, she reports for the BBC. In America, there's Brandy Zadrozny, who reports for NBC. There's April Slater, who reports for NBC. There's Carol Cadwallader in the UK, who writes for The Guardian. All of these women have been harassed horribly for the work that they do, because it is a known tactic to try and chill the speech of these, particularly women. And so I think that's something also that we can't ignore when we're having these sorts of conversations. And finally, a concept that I want to discuss with you is this idea called the tipping point, which is if you're a reporter, you can always find misinformation to report on. But simply by reporting it, you can cause more harm. But if you let something go for too long, it's very, very difficult to debunk that rumor. So, for example, with QAnon, which you may have heard about, which is this increasingly global conspiracy, it was connected to Pizzagate. It's about there being a kind of a world order. There are rumors about sex trafficking, politicians drinking the blood of children. I mean, it's really problematic, very similar to the protocols of Elders of Zion, but that's another lecture. But that conspiracy, for a number of years, newsrooms said, well, we're not going to report on QAnon because we don't want to give it legitimacy. But in many ways now, there's a recognition that QAnon has really moved into Instagram and onto yoga communities and wellness communities. And QAnon has really started to take hold. It's moving outside the US. It's now taking hold in the UK and Germany. And journalists are saying, well, hang on, maybe we should have reported on this earlier. And so this question of the tipping point is really hard. But here are some of the questions as a journalist you might want to think about, which is how much engagement is a particular rumor getting? How many people are actually sharing this? Not just liking, but how many are sharing it? Is it moving from one community to another? So you might remember the Plandemic video from May, which was an anti-vaccine, half-an-hour documentary, very, very professional. Well, it started off in anti-vaccine groups, but then it moved into mainstream groups. And I was like, uh-oh, we've got a problem here because it's actually moved out of the fringe communities. Is it moving across platforms? You might be seeing it on YouTube, but can you also find it on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook? Influencers, did an influencer share it? We had a problem in March when there was the rumor that 5G was spreading coronavirus. And we had been tracking that for 3 months. And we kept saying to newsrooms, no, don't report on it. It's still very, very low level. It's not worth reporting it. And then Woody Harrelson, who is a celebrity, shared it on social media. And then all of a sudden, it got all of this traction and everybody was talking about it. And we said to newsrooms, now is when you need to debunk this 5G rumor, because unfortunately, it's past the tipping point. And finally, are other journalists or news outlets reporting it? You can be the most responsible newsroom in Spain, but if other people are starting to report on it, then there is an argument that you should also start reporting on that rumor as well. So if you're going to report on it, how should you report on it? So I'm now going to talk about 4 psychological theories that should help you when you're thinking about these issues. And they are taken from something called the Debunking Handbook by John Cook and Stefan Lewandowski. And I just also want to stress that there is some debate in the academic literature about some of these issues. Is there a backfire effect? If you report on rumors, does it make them more memorable? And academics are still doing a lot of work on this because it depends on what the rumor is. It depends on how the debunk is. It depends on who the audience is. So it's still out there, but I just wanted to let you know that what I'm talking to you now is best practices as we understand it right now. So the first one is this idea of the familiarity backfire effect, which is try and whenever possible when reporting to focus on the facts. Avoid repeating a falsehood unnecessarily while correcting it. And where possible, warn readers before repeating falsehoods. So people talk about the truth sandwich, which is you lead with the facts, you then say, but rumors are circulating that, but you've given a warning, and then you end with the facts again. Because unfortunately, our brains are really, really lazy. All of us, we're like lizards. And so if something is repeated, it becomes familiar to us. Repetition and familiarity mean we're more likely to remember something for a longer period of time. So even if you're debunking it, 2 weeks later, I'm like, she said something about, and you end up going back and connecting the dots. So we have to be very careful about repeating rumors unless we do it very, very carefully. So these kind of things are a disaster. So when you see people say 5 myths about coronavirus and they just list the myths, it's really bad because our brains end up remembering the myths. So on this flyer, somebody might say, yeah, but I've added the facts. But the way that it's lined up here is that I can end up just reading the myths and remembering those myths. And this is a very bad, I think this was a student version of something. But look, this is a more serious version of the same thing, which is the falsehoods are the things that are in bold and in a bigger font. The facts are in smaller text and is not bolded. This is not how we should be doing this. Wherever possible, put all of the emphasis on the facts. And if you're going to include the rumor, warn people beforehand that it is a rumor. And even things like headlines. This is obviously a terrible headline. Is 5G going to kill us all? Even if the text has all the nuance, we have to be incredibly careful now about our headlines and our tweets, because unfortunately, too many people don't read the nuance. They just read and share the headlines. So yes, this would get a lot of clicks, but it's really a very irresponsible headline. And even things like this. So this is an ad that was taken out by the WHO, and they have got the question in the blue text. Do 5G mobile networks spread COVID-19? I don't need you to remind me of that connection, WHO. I want you to very in bold tell me 5G doesn't do this, and then if I click on it, I can get the facts. But if I'm skimming down, this is not a great way for me to be reassured in a world where people are less likely to click through. Secondly, this is called the overkill backfire effect, which is that you need to make debunks easy to process. So think about making your content simple, short, and easy to read. Again, those of us who work in fact-checking, journalism, research, we love lots and lots of words. It is not the best way of doing the kind of work that we need to do now, because we live in a visual culture and we need highly shareable graphics. So this is me being a little bit naughty, but this is from the Australian Government Department of Health. This is a 170-page PDF answering questions about vaccinations, not one image in this PDF. And this is what they're fighting against. And I apologize, this is not a great image, but it's making a point, which is this is what the other side is using. Very, very emotive visuals to make a point. And this is what our side is using. Lots and lots of text, no visuals, very, very dry. And this is very, very emotive. And so we have to understand that we have to use the same tool. We shouldn't be emotive in that way. But if we don't recognize that the playing field is not level, then we've got a problem. And there are great examples. So this, the flatten the curve, this to me should win a Pulitzer Prize. It's taking a very, very complex issue and simplifying it in one very shareable graph. Similarly, things like this isn't perfect, but how can you explain complexity in a visual, engaging way? Again, this has got text, but it's nice. It's more shareable on Instagram than a 170-page PDF. And there's somebody in New Zealand called Susie Wilkes who just does the most amazing graphics and GIFs. And she just, again, takes complex issues and makes them more simple through things like this. So again, I would spend, if I had a lot of money, I would give every newsroom and every health authority access to proper designers and graphic illustrators, because we need much more of them because of the world that we live in. And this is the WHO that partnered with Pinterest. They have this thing called Mythbusters. And so it's great. I mean, it's not a 180-page PDF, but there's still a lot of text on these blue tiles. So we've all got a lot of work to do to think about how do we illustrate complexity. And it is challenging. Science is complex. Science is full of nuance. But unfortunately, in our current communications ecosystem, people are seeking simplicity. And rumors and conspiracies are simple stories. And therefore, people are drawn to those simple stories because the complexity of real life right now is difficult, because all of us have had our lives turned upside down and we're desperately seeking explanations. And so complexity and nuance is not what we're seeking. And that's why we're in a difficult situation. Third, the worldview backfire effect. It's very tempting when talking about conspiracies to use ridicule or derogatory comments. And we should be much more careful to ensure that we don't do that. So here are headlines: dumb, nonsense, bizarre, wild, insane. This is absolutely the worst way to talk to people who believe in conspiracies. And this study suggests that tweets mocking 5G conspiracy theories about COVID-19 may have inadvertently popularized it. So we have to be much more careful. We need to use empathy with people. And this is a piece in Vox by my friend, actually, Danigal Young. We went to graduate school together. At the age of 33, she lost her husband, Mike, in this image, to a brain tumor. And in this piece, she explains how she desperately wanted explanation for what had happened to Mike. And therefore, she ended up searching on Google and finding these different explanations for why he might have got a brain tumor. And this is a very personal explanation of, I was a conspiracy theorist too. And she explains why, in this moment, so many people are turning to conspiracies. So when somebody in your family is sharing a conspiracy theory, don't say, oh, duh, you're wrong. Read this, uncle. Instead, we should be like, wow, it's interesting that you shared that. Like, I'm really asking a lot of questions myself about these issues, but I'm worried that some of this content is being used to divide us, our family, our communities, our neighborhood. I'd love to talk to you about ways that we can understand what's happening, because I'm really worried about this kind of information that's coming from others. So you're using language like you, us, neighborhood, family, our, as opposed to you're wrong, here's a fact check. So, because when you do that, you are shaming somebody. Remember, social media is about people's identity. So you're embarrassing them by saying that what they believe is wrong. And so you want to use empathy. You want to listen so that they don't feel shame. And instead, you are connecting yourself to them. And finally, try to answer questions that the debunk might surface. So if you're saying to somebody, it's false, they're like, well, and a space opens up in their brain, but unless you fill that space with an explanation, they're left just believing the debunk. So this is a great headline from the Anchorage Daily News in Alaska. Major funder of anti-vaccine movement makes millions selling natural health products. We need to be focusing on the tactics and techniques used by these bad actors to help explain to people why they're seeing certain types of content. So to end the lecture with some key takeaways. Firstly, this is the report that was mentioned in the introduction. And what we wanted to do was to understand the way that narratives shape the way that people think about things. So too often, we, fact checkers, researchers, journalists, we focus on atoms of content. Is this post true or false? Should this post be labeled by Twitter? Should this post be downranked by Facebook? And by focusing on those atoms of content, we're failing to understand how all of those atoms get constructed as part of bigger narratives. So that's what we need to focus on, is narratives as opposed to atoms of content. And so with vaccines, there are many people who are connecting vaccines with liberty and freedom. There is a narrative that people want to take away people's freedom. There's these narratives about people want to microchip you, people want to survey you through vaccines. But instead, if we're going to counter those narratives, we need to use the same narratives of liberty and freedom to say, by taking the vaccine, we will be free to hug our families again. We will be free to travel to Barcelona again. So we need to understand narratives if we're going to counter them. Secondly, we need to focus on the tactics and techniques. So Camille Francois from Graphica talks about actors, behaviors, content. Now, when we fact check, we're only focusing on the content, but what we need to be saying is who is pushing this type of content and what tactics are they using to do that. And the more that we educate people about that, the better off they are in terms of identifying it. And that comes from really interesting research that's called Inoculation Theory, which is if you teach people the tactics and techniques, they are more likely to spot misinformation when they see it in the wild. And this is a really great paragraph from that piece. This is from John Cook, who did this research. I found that explaining the misinformation technique completely neutralized the misinformation's influence without even mentioning the misinformation specifically. And he ends, whether you're conservative or liberal, no one wants to be deceived by misleading techniques. Because if you wait to fact check something, people's confirmation bias kicks in, their identity kicks in, and they double down on their beliefs because they think you're trying to convert them. If you instead teach them before they see that content, you might be manipulated in these ways, people are more likely to identify it when they see it. 3, we need to stop focusing disproportionately on technical solutions. Social listening dashboards, artificial intelligence, blockchain, apps. Every day I get emails from people telling me that they've built an app that can solve fake news. Those emails go straight in my spam folder because this is a human problem. When people say, well, look at WhatsApp in India, it caused mob violence. Well, somebody I know in India said, when I look at WhatsApp in India, it reminds me of the role of radio in Rwanda before the civil war in Rwanda. These technical platforms are sitting on top of society. They are reflecting human traits, and we have to put humans at the center of our responses. 4th, we need to stop muting our uncles. As I just said, we can no longer ignore family and friends who are pushing problematic, false, conspiratorial content. We have to start holding each other to account and saying, it's not frivolous just because it's on social media. It's a little bit like throwing out a can of Coke from the car. If just one of us does it, it's not great, but it's not terrible. If everybody does it, we have a really horrible, rubbish-strewn society. And it's the same with social media. We live in polluted information environments, and we need to take responsibility with each other to clean up our information ecosystem. And we need to put the community at the center of any intervention. If I go to any misinformation conference, there are people from platforms, there are people from governments, there are media literacy educators, But my mum is never there. The public is never there. And the public needs to be part of these conversations because they need to say, what type of content do you want to see on Facebook? What kind of content do you want to have taken down? What kind of content do you want to have labeled? What kind of content do you think is permissible? And we just aren't having those conversations as a society. And I don't want governments and platforms making those decisions. I want people to think through these challenges and to be part of the conversations about any interventions. So, further resources. If any part of this has excited you, we have an online course. It's in Spanish, it's not in Catalan, apologies. It's called Coronavirus, an online course for journalists. And, oh, I just tried to do something clever. It's at covid.firstdraftnews.org. Oh, look, I just did something clever and now I'm broken the whole internet. I don't know what to do next. Oh. So I'm at the end of my course. I had one more slide, but I seem to have broken it. So I should put the link into the chat. But does anybody have any questions?
Thank you very much, Claire. Many thanks for your lecture. You have clearly identified the different types of disinformation disorders in the current cultured and complex media landscape. Thank you for sharing with our students and faculty the tactics and best practices to be aware of those disorders and work to debunk false and misleading information. Now I will invite our students and faculty in general to ask questions or comments. Podeu aixecar la mà a Blackboard Collaborate i per ordre us donarem la paraula perquè pugueu intervenir. Podeu intervenir també en l'idioma que vulgueu i nosaltres farem el que puguem amb l'idioma. It's time for questions. Okay. Jan Tellez is the first one.
Good afternoon, Claire. My question is very simple. Can Donald Trump be classified as one of the biggest enemies of disinformation? And if it's true, at what scale? At manipulated or at fabricated content?
Yes, so this is an important point, and of course it's politically sensitive, but for the 6 months leading up to the US election, all journalists wanted to ask was, are Russians going to meddle in the election? And the horrible truth is that the worst disinformation campaign it has come from domestic actors. And unfortunately, the president, for 5 months saying that there was going to be a fraudulent election and continuing to push those falsehoods has been the worst example of disinformation that we've seen. And so it's part of the information ecosystem. We've seen it in other countries as well. Politicians, unfortunately, have a vested interest in pushing disinformation. So yes, we have seen fabricated content, misleading content, all sorts of problematic content from the president and many other people domestically in the US. And unfortunately, I think this is any information landscape is going to include this now from going forward, and we have to be on our guard for it.
Okay, thank you very much. Carles Hortolà.
Hola, bona tarda, se m'escolta?
Sí, endavant.
Sí. Hi, good evening. QAnon is a frightening example, I think, in my opinion, of how rumors and conspiracy theories can create even a terrorist group, as per the FBI assessments last year. So QAnon has started to appear recently in Spain in alt-right demonstrations. In your opinion, why QAnon has gained so many popularity in the USA, and what lessons, if any, can we learn from the US to debunk them here in Spain? And by the way, sorry, yeah. a kind of Spanish parodic newspaper could be El Mundo Today.
Ah, thank you. So it's a really good question, because we have seen a terrifying rise in beliefs in conspiracy theories, and QAnon is an example of that. So the first thing I'd say is, A, take it seriously. Don't dismiss it, take it seriously. And the second thing I would say is understand why people are susceptible to conspiracy theories. Don't say, well, those people are stupid. Right now, people's lives have turned upside down. They've lost their jobs. They can't see their family. They don't know what their future looks like. And they are desperately worried. And so in that, and they haven't left their houses. So just basic anxiety levels are higher than ever before. And when people are fearful, they are looking for these explanations. And so when somebody comes along and says, your life is like this because there is a secret group of people controlling everything, that has resonance. People are like, yes, it's not my fault that my life is like this. There's something out of my control. And so then QAnon gives you this sense of efficacy. So in terms of how to manage it, I would say the most powerful reporting Spanish reporters could do is to talk to families that have been impacted by QAnon. So the BBC and CNN have done good, only recently, but good reporting with families where basically people don't talk to each other anymore. And they talk about the implications of these conspiracies on families. Also, where possible, find people that have left QAnon. There's a really good podcast by the New York Times called Rabbit Hole. And in that podcast, I think episode 7, they find a woman who basically was a QAnon supporter. And then she recognized that it was just full of people it was a hoax. And so she talks about how she got fooled. And so I think the more that you can focus on the tactics and the techniques of the QAnon community, the better. But also remember that community element. In that podcast, many people said, I work night shifts, and on my phone all night, I could connect with people via QAnon. They were there for me. They listened to me. That's what a conspiracy theory offers people. It's offering them community when they are lonely. And so we can't just go, this is crazy. We have to understand why people are susceptible, and it's all psychological. And that needs to be critical in the reporting you do about it.
Thank you, Claire. It's time for Ferran. Go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon, Claire. Thanks for this amazing lecture. I would like to ask you about quantum conspiracy theory as well. How troubling can be reporting about this conspiracy in an age where people like Harvey Weinstein and Jeffrey Epstein have managed to cover up thousands of sexual assault and sexual trafficking cases?
Yep, again, great question. And that's the challenge here, which is sex crimes and pedophilia have always been part of disinformation campaigns because it's impossible to debunk, because people say, well, it's happening behind closed doors. So how can you prove that it's not happening? And so you're absolutely right that in the context of Jeffrey Epstein, here you have a very powerful man with very powerful friends hiding something very, very serious. So again, rather than focusing on the content, remember the ABCs, focus on why sex crimes are used as a way to discredit people. So try and show the history of that. And as I mentioned, the similarities between the protocols of the elders of Zion, which as we know are the oldest anti-Semitic tropes. If you read that and compare to QAnon, you see the absolute similarities. So by reporting on that this isn't new, that's what we need to focus on, as opposed to, well, maybe there is sex trafficking happening, because then that's how QAnon is managing to recruit, by connecting it to saying, well, don't you care about children? Well, of course we all care about children, but it's a deliberate recruitment tactic. So again, focusing on the tactics and the techniques is a really critical one. And again, those of you who love podcasts, On the Media, which is a WNYC podcast, has done great reporting over the last 3 months on ways to report on QAnon. So I'd really recommend that, because they've done a lot of explaining. So for example, the Instagram element, QAnon has moved into Instagram, and you have people who love yoga becoming part of QAnon conspiracy, while showing that tactic as a way of getting people who feel like they're open-minded is a deliberate tactic. So exposing the tactics is a really good way of doing this reporting.
Thank you, Claire. Jan Tellez, I think that you are coming again. Thank you.
Yeah. My question is, can culture influence on how disinformation spreads? And for example, is Japan more or less likely to suffer disinformation?
It's a great question. So unfortunately, even though culture is important, we are all humans. And something that I once read that I've never forgotten is this, is that gorillas connect with one another by picking fleas off each other's fur. We don't have fur, so we gossip. And so unfortunately, it's a very human trait to want to share what we know or what we think we know. There are differences by culture. So for example, in places like Indonesia, where there is a less, advanced media ecosystem or information ecosystem, if somebody posts something on Facebook and somebody else isn't sure, rather than going to Wikipedia or Google or the news media, they will ask other friends and family. So you do have certain cultures where this is spreading very quickly on places like WhatsApp because they're turning to one another because they don't have trusted media ecosystems. And unfortunately, as somebody living in the US, I see the same thing happening in the US. We don't have a shared public media system. So half the country is watching Fox News, half the country is watching CNN, and there's no place where they're connecting together. And so people are starting to turn to information sources that reinforce their existing views, whereas countries that have a strong media ecosystem, and the UK is not perfect and the BBC is not perfect, but when I compare a country that has something like the BBC, where 87% of British people bump into the BBC every day in some way, it feels very different than countries that have a very fragmented ecosystem. So it's a good question about culture. It's a mixture of culture and how advanced the information ecosystem is. Those two things play a part. But unfortunately, as humans, we're all terrible. And with coronavirus, we saw the same rumors popping up in WhatsApp groups in Madrid, Mexico City, Sydney, Tokyo, Buenos Aires, like the same rumors, because as humans, we all felt scared and we were all sharing that, oh, have you seen this? I think you can gargle with salt water, because we were all seeking explanations for this incredibly scary moment.
Thank you, Claire, again. It's the turn of Nereida. Nereida? We are having some...
Yes.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Good afternoon. Okay, good afternoon. Thank you, Claire, for this extraordinary lesson. You said we have an emotional relationship to information. So my question is, how can science and scientific information, which is not emotional, compete with this kind of narrative when science and scientific information is complex, not simply, and sometimes don't say people what they need and they want to listen?
Yeah, I mean, you have just described the central challenge of our time, which is science and research is slow, it is complex, it is continuously evolving. But what we see in this communication ecosystem is that people want that certainty. So I think this question about emotion and science, most scientists are scientists, they're not communication experts. So how can we work with communication experts to say, where's the story of what will happen when the vaccine is rolled out? What's the story of the science? Tell us, using emotion, the excitement of being the scientist in the Pfizer trial. What does it mean to be somebody who was in the vaccine trial? Tell me those stories, because science has to remain scientific. It has to remain rational. It has to remain factual. But what we need to do is tell the stories of the science so that we can engage in the same way as those people who are trying to undermine science. We can't keep saying, oh, God, those people, they're here. They are having a bigger influence on our information landscape. We, those of us who work in the quality information system, we have to adapt and evolve. And that involves putting story at the center of everything, which is why, as journalists, you're so critical. But I don't think we can say science is factual, misinformation is emotional, and therefore that's the problem. We need to find ways to make science exciting and emotional, but not lose the facts part of it. And that's the challenge that we have right now.
Thank you. It's turn of Emma Monros.
Yes, you said before that you refused all of technological solutions that were proposed to you, and I agree with you that it's a human problem. But what is it about those solutions that you disregard or that make you view them as not a practical solution?
Thank you for asking that follow-up, because I was being a little bit silly. It's not that I refuse all technical solutions, but I hate the idea that only technology will get us out of this. So if somebody comes to me and says, I've built a technology, but I've built it by working with fact checkers and journalists, and I've listened to what they need, then I'm more interested. My slight annoyance is when people don't talk to those of us who do this work and believe that you can just use technology in a vacuum. Because a lot of the tools that we use at First Draft, they automate processes that it makes it easier and quicker to do the work that we do, but it doesn't take humans out of the loop. What we need is a combination of humans and technology, because neither of these solutions can work by themselves. We need to be working together. And my slight frustration is people who say, okay, you just need machine learning algorithms. They'll just do all of this automatically. And in fact, if you remember at the beginning, I had those 7 types of mis and disinformation. And I had all of these computer scientists coming to me saying, okay, can we just take your typology and we're just going to create a machine learning algorithm? And I'd say, well, they're not mutually exclusive categories. Something can be misleading and also they can be fabricated. Oh, it's fine. And of course, nobody could create a machine learning algorithm because they weren't mutually exclusive. So you have to have people to say, this is messy. This work is messy. And the most effective misinformation is not false. It's the stuff that's really like right on the edge. And that's why computers alone can't do this work. Computers can help us get there more quickly, but then you need humans to really make sense of this content.
Thank you. Paul, Isana, it's your turn.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, sure.
So there was a brief moment in your presentation where you mentioned malinformation, which is the use of genuine information to harm someone. My question is being biased on some conflict, like some elections, for example, for instance, malinformation, and until what point is it really legitimate?
So, I mean, this is a good point. So, for example, with malinformation, sometimes I would argue that leaked emails are malinformation. But on other hands, leaked emails is in the public interest. That's whistleblowing. We have whistleblowers for a reason. So you do have to be careful with this question of bias, which is, it's very easy to say, well, that's malinformation because I don't like the harm that has been done, but maybe there is a public interest for that to be seen. So it's an important point, particularly around election disinformation, that we need to be very careful that we don't get seduced into believing that something should be hidden when really it's much better that it's out in the open. And, you know, we see that with the debate about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, like this constant, what was meant to be available and what should be hidden. It's very, very difficult. And that's why malinformation is in the report as a way to say, we can't ignore it because it's part of our information ecosystem, but it's harder to define because it depends on the context or the circumstance.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure if Nereida wants to re-ask again. No, it's not. She's not. Okay, is there anyone else who wants to participate? We have to apologize because of the connection of our colleague Xavier Ramon, that he's like flighting just to intervene, and he has a question for you, Dr. Wardle, that he asked me to forward you, right? He says,
To which extent the fixation on immediacy that permeates the ASAP journalism, accelerated news culture, is affecting the spread of disinformation?
Yeah, it's certainly very true that we have lower quality news outlets who recognize that they can get traffic through even doing debunks, and not even low quality. There is a major news organization that ran a false video. And then when I said, well, you know, it's false. And somebody, the head of digital video said, well, yeah, but to be honest, Claire, we'll get double the hits on the debunk. So in his head, he was okay with them running a false video because they could get double the traffic. We do have to recognize that news outlets that are running poor quality headlines, they're running bad graphics, misleading reports, running with press releases, like that is part of information disorder. So I think we have to recognize that just because we can move quickly, are we actually building trust? And right now, when trust in news organization is going down, we need to be even more careful. And every small mistake that gets made gets amplified and used as, well, look, I told you, it's fake news. So there's really no room for mistakes to be made. So I do think we do have to be very careful. Just because in digital media you can issue a correction, like in the days of print, the idea of having a mistake on the front page would be horrifying. Now people say, oh, it's all right, we'll just edit it, we'll just, put a correction, it's fine. And I worry that we've kind of lost the recognition that any mistakes that were made is feeding into this idea that all information can be changed and edited, and who can you trust? And that's the thing that I worry about the most.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure, Carlas, if we have enough time for 2 more questions. I think that we have in queue Meritxell and Jan. We are on time for these 2 more?
Yeah, I think 5 minutes, no, or more or less.
Yeah, okay. If you don't mind, Claire, we go ahead with this, the last 2 ones, right? Meritxell de Jaumar, is your time for the question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Great. I'm going to be brief. You've talked about how some social media are beginning to label some tweets or posts as misleading information, and I would like to ask you about how this is starting a new problem that we didn't have before. Like, I think some months ago, I heard Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talking about how important it is that, apart from knowing what is misinformation and what's not, that we should also know who is verifying what we receive. Like, if there is no control about who is a verifier and who is not, we are not really advancing, are we? Like, what do you think about that? Because I feel that we should, apart of that knowing what is false, we should also know who is verifying what, because there's also interest in that. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question. So there is research into this. It's called the illusory truth effect. So the idea is if you only label certain things, people assume that everything else is true. So there is a bit of an issue with us starting to use these labels. And I say, as a researcher, it's good that we are experimenting with labels, but my deep frustration is that we don't have any independent researchers working with Twitter and Facebook to independently assess what impact these labels are having, because there might be unintended consequences, as you've alluded to. And I think the second thing you've also emphasized is that there's a lot of effort right now on misinformation. So first off, we get funded because everybody's obsessed with misinformation. How do we get rid of the misinformation? What we're not funding is how do we ensure that we have quality journalism, quality storytelling, quality science communication that is also at the top of Google search results. We can't have one without the other. And I think the frustration is we've said, oh, it's okay, we've got the WHO, we've got the New York Times, but are they creating compelling content that ends up at the top of a Facebook or Instagram visual search? So I think your point and AOC's point is exactly right. We need to be investing as much in the down ranking of the poor quality information as we are at up ranking. And we need to be careful about labels, because but the idea that you would label verified content, that in itself can be problematic. Newsrooms are verifiable as a whole, But what happens when you have a problematic story? Every newsroom makes mistakes. So do you label at the article level or do you label at the newsroom level? There are lots of people thinking about these issues, but it's very, very complicated, which is why we still don't have solutions, unfortunately.
Okay, and the last question, Jan Tellez, again, right?
I'm afraid this is not an yes or no question, so it might be quite complex. In the lecture, you were highlighting that a great amount of text might lead to lose track of important information. Don't you think that this way we are creating, at some extent, illiterate citizens?
No, I want everything. I want us to have really good long form information, but I also want us to have engaging visuals that gets people thinking about these issues. Because I think we have a bias towards 800 words or 2,000 words or 170-page PDFs. We have a lot of that. We have one flatten the curve diagram. So what I want us to think about is, how do we have both? Because I love text. I've got a PhD, I love reading. I'm not asking that we stop that, but my frustration is, when I showed you that meme of the doll, I spend all day looking at memes like that. My whole team spend all day looking at that kind of content. And all I know is, the other side, all we have is PDFs. And we have to find a balance between those two things, because the other side is doing it. And I want us to show that we can have compelling stories in visual format as well as text. And I think that's all that I'm asking for.
Okay, thank you very much for all this time, all the speech and the answering. So thank you very much, all the participation for also be here, and the participation now. Carles Pont, it's time for closing this session.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you very much, Claire. It has been a very clear and very didactic conference. Thank you, Emma, Elena, and all the people who have helped us, the organization. Gràcies a tothom. Bé, ara em toca fer una cosa que és una mica estranya, però que s'ha de fer, és el que diu el protocol, que és donar per inaugurat el curs, encara que, com bé sabeu, ja fa gairebé un mes i mig, gairebé dos, que estem a classe i, per tant, es diu que la lliçó inaugural és el moment de donar per inaugurat el curs. Per tant, bon curs per tothom i que vagi molt bé. Thank you very much. Gràcies a tothom. Fins una altra.